I've been working on some comments and some reflections on John Loftus's book entitled Why I Became an Atheist that I hold in my hand here. In this book, in this presentation, I'd like to just make some comments or observations about his critique of Aquinas' cosmological arguments for God. And the reason why I want to do this is not just because I want to pick out that part of his book, but it is one of the areas that I've spoken about before in other presentations. And I tend to, when I read books by atheists, I tend to look especially at their treatment of Aquinas. First of all, because Aquinas is frequently quoted or referred to in the context of arguments for God's existence. Secondly, because I find that more often than not, the people who comment on Aquinas have taken very little or no time to really understand him seriously or to think through his ideas. And so what I tend to find is that people who comment on Aquinas, with very few exceptions, people who comment on Aquinas' arguments have a very surface and inadequate knowledge of those or understanding of those particular arguments. This was blaringly true in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, where he spends maybe 3 or 4 pages talking about Aquinas' 5 ways, 5 arguments that he offers for God's existence. And those discussions of those arguments show how poorly he had really come to understand those arguments, and the fact that he has no, apparently according to the footnotes and references that he has no familiarity whatsoever with the many, many volumes and articles, perhaps thousands of books and articles have been written on those arguments through the years. He seems to have no appreciation of that whole tradition, both on Aristotle as well as Aquinas and their treatment of those arguments. So when I got Mr. Loftus's book, after reading the first 3 or 4 chapters, I turned especially to the chapter on the existence of God to see how he dealt with Aquinas there. And what I found was, as is typically the case with atheist writers, what I found was very disappointing. The first thing he does is he tries to summarize the background to the argument. So he tries to give us a little bit of a sense of the importance of Aquinas historically, a little bit about the philosophical tradition behind Aquinas and that preceded Aquinas, all of which strikes me as surface. He doesn't seem to really grasp the significance of what he's saying. There are a couple of inaccuracies in the statements that he makes, but nothing important enough for me to bring up here. But it's just the way things are described. It seems to suggest he's maybe reading a history of philosophy book over here and then summarizing it in his book. But in any case, whatever the truth of that is, he doesn't seem to have, to my experience, he doesn't have much of a profound grasp of the ancient philosophical tradition. And because I've taken a fair amount of time in my life to study people like Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and Augustine and Aquinas, these are people that I've spent a great deal of time thinking about and studying their writings and teaching on them and working through a graduate program that specialized in St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval philosophy and ancient philosophy. And I've got a number of friends and colleagues and professors that have influenced me through the years who have written extensively on these various persons. I've got some books right behind me here of one of my professors who has written at great length on medieval philosophy. In fact, one of those books is called Medieval Philosophy Revisited or Revised, I think is the name of it. No, Redefined, by John Deely, one of my professors who has written many thousands of pages on medieval and ancient philosophy and contemporary philosophy as well. And so because my mind's been saturated with this stuff for a long time and I've thought a lot about it, what I tend to do is go in these books and see what do they have to say about those things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And again, what I tend to find is their knowledge is very, very limited, and their characterizations are often very, very inadequate and distortions of those people that they're commenting on. So with that in mind, there's several paragraphs that he devotes to Aquinas here. Obviously, he's more interested in talking about the Kalam argument that William Lane Craig, one of his professors, liked to defend and likes to use. I'm not concerned about the Kalam argument right now. Maybe I'll react to it at another time. But Aquinas doesn't use the Kalam argument. It's primarily associated with Muslim philosophy. Aquinas takes a very different approach. Aquinas does not try to prove that the world must be finite in its duration. Aquinas thinks that it's at least theoretically possible that God chose from all eternity to create a world. And therefore there could be an eternal world or an eternal world of becoming, that there could have been change forever. Only that God is the cause of that change or the ground of that change, but there could be a world of unending change. The Kalam argument seeks to argue that the world had to have a beginning, and because it had to have a beginning, there must be some cause, eternal cause, that brought about that beginning. Aquinas does not offer that argument. Instead, what he proposes, and Mr. Loftus mentions this, although I don't think he sees the full impact of it in the arguments that he makes, or the critical responses that he makes to Aquinas, he recognizes that Aquinas is not talking about a temporal beginning of the world. Instead, what he's talking about is there can't be an infinity of present cause and effect relationships upon which this present moment depends in the terms of a hierarchical series of causes. To use an example borrowed from a book by Garrigou-Lagrange, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, a Dominican scholar earlier in the 20th century, who wrote many books on this subject of the existence of God and Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. He uses the example of the wheels in a watch. If you take a watch and you look at its various different moving parts, you could multiply those moving parts to infinity, but you still wouldn't have a functioning watch until you have the appropriate spring in the watch. So in other words, you have to have not just wheels or turning parts in the watch, but you have to have the right parts in order for it to move. If there's not a cause of its motion, you can have an endless series of moving parts, but you'll never have the actual functioning of the thing. To use another example, you could have an infinity of train cars. Or let's say you have 10 train cars. They will sit there and not move until you have a motor or a locomotive part of the train that will pull it or move it along. And so what Aquinas is arguing is that when you have a series of dependent cause and effect relationships, you can't have an infinity of those at the same time that depend upon yet higher causes. So right now I depend on certain things, like the air that I breathe. If the air that I breathe is sucked out of this room and sucked off the planet, I'm not going to be able to breathe anymore. I'm going to die, because my life right now depends on the reality of that cause. But the continuance of oxygen on this planet is dependent on a variety of other causal factors, like the plants and the sun and the various things creating the atmosphere of our planet. So all of these things are simultaneously dependent on yet higher forms of causal relationships. And you can't have an infinity of those satisfied in a finite moment. So if you had to have an infinity of things happen right now in order for me to breathe, I couldn't breathe. I would never get to a breath, because there would be an infinity of things that had to be satisfied in a finite moment of time in order for me to be able to breathe. And that's Aquinas' argument, is that you can't have an endless series of things that depend upon one another in order to explain a given current effect. You ultimately have to have something that depends on nothing at all. And then he thinks about what that something must be. Now, with that as background, let's see what Mr. Loftus has to say. After summarizing Aquinas' arguments, which I think are woefully too short or inadequate, he goes on to say, he quotes several other writers, which is interesting to me because he doesn't engage much in his own critique of Aquinas. Instead, what he does is he depends upon several authorities, or people who give him various criticisms of Aquinas. It's especially noticeable here in this part of his book. In other parts of his arguments, he launches off into his own series of criticisms. Here, it's primarily quoting other people, other authorities. Very interesting that he does that, because it suggests the same kind of approach that he takes to Christianity, that people just accept what somebody else says. I don't know how much he's digested the things that are being said here, but let's take a look at him. He says, according to Ed Miller, St. Thomas really thought of his 5 ways as variations of a single idea. That's not that important. He goes on, in essence, there obviously is, in the 5 arguments of Aquinas, there is a kind of core argument that is being made, or assumptions that are present in those arguments. Those assumptions are defended elsewhere as being required and necessary and logical. Aquinas' arguments are very quickly presented. Elsewhere, he presents the principles that those arguments are based upon. So he goes on in the next paragraph to say, there are many things that could be said in criticism of Aquinas' 5 ways, especially in light of the Big Bang theory, which has shown our universe began to exist. First of all, the Big Bang theory, so far as I can tell, would pose no question for Aquinas. as he says a little bit earlier, that Aquinas' argument assumes the eternity of the world, but it doesn't require the eternity of the world. That seems to be, at least possibly, what Mr. Loftus is alluding to here, is that Aquinas' arguments assume there's an eternal world. It doesn't require an eternal world, but just assuming that the world is eternal, does that exclude the need for God? And Aquinas argues that no, even if the world has lasted forever or has been here forever, we still need God to sustain the world, or to be the ground of the motion of the world from all eternity as well as now. But he says, in light of the Big Bang Theory, is it the case, I don't know what he's trying to argue from that. It's an unexplained point. The only thing I can imagine is the Big Bang Theory suggests that the world had a beginning and that time and space have a beginning, but that would not be a problem to Aquinas. That would be consistent with what Aquinas actually believes, is that the world had a beginning. But he doesn't think he can philosophically demonstrate that must be true. Then he goes on to say, which has shown that our universe began to exist along with the concept of inertia, which does away with the need to explain motion as requiring either a regress of causes or an unmoved mover. Now this is a very profound statement. Unfortunately, he doesn't explain the statement. I don't think inertia, or the idea that things continue in motion unless acted upon by another thing, or a resisting force, the Newtonian laws of motion and so on, I don't think that that would pose any serious problem to Aquinas at all. The idea is that you put something in motion and it will remain in motion until acted upon by some outside force. And the assumption being made here is that because a thing would remain in motion, there's no need for a mover, and therefore the universe, presumably the argument is, could just remain in motion forever without any need of a moving cause. The problem here with this is that the idea of motion is not the same thing that Aquinas means by motion. Aquinas means by motion the actualization of possibility, or what makes it possible for something to come to be. In the case of a moving thing, what is it that allows a thing to continue moving unless acted upon by an outside force? Well, certainly the material constitution of a thing relative to the space-time world in which it finds itself and in which it is undergoing motion, the initial impetus or force that brought it into motion. But Aquinas' notion of change or motion is broader than just local motion, moving from one place in space to another. He's talking about any coming to be of something that wasn't before. When we talk about an object, say I drop a ball and there's nothing to hinder it and it continues to fall through space unless there's some type of friction acting against it. This I don't think would cause any problem for Aquinas, because he would simply point out that it's the nature of space and it's the nature of the object in space, given the initial impetus or movement of the thing, and the world around it, or the universe around it, or the space-time world around it, that is allowing it to continue in its spatial progression. That's not the same thing as saying that you could have nothing account for something. It's not the same thing as saying that you could have effects come about without causes, or you could have an event without a cause of the event. These are all very different contexts. So to talk about the Newtonian understanding of motion and inertia, or a thing's continuance in motion until acted upon by an outside force, is to miss Aquinas' understanding of what motion is, which again is the coming to be of something that wasn't before. So he goes on and says, nonetheless, Michael Martin argues, again he quotes someone else, Michael Martin argues that Aquinas gives us no non-question begging reason why there could not be a temporal infinite regress of causes. Again, here I think in the argument itself Aquinas doesn't do that. Aquinas doesn't offer all of those arguments in the summary of his argument. The assumption in the arguments is that a person understands the other reasons for that conclusion that may be found elsewhere, for example in Aristotle and in his presentation of the argument for God from motion. But I'm about out of time, so I'd better stop for now. There are some other things that I'd like to highlight from his critique of Aquinas, but I'll finish those later.